Okay, so we're here in the studio with Tom Parsons. Tom, you're head of Tenable in Ireland and you're also VP of Product Management. Welcome to the studio.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, look, we're delighted to have you here. I'm going to kick off by getting you to introduce us to Tenable as an organisation, globally, and then maybe tell us a little bit about the Irish operation.
Yeah, sounds good. So Tenable is an exposure management company. In fact, the leader, according to three analyst firms, so Gartner, IDC and Forrester, have named us as a leader, and the only company to be named as a leader by those three analyst organisations within the past year or so in what we call exposure management. And to the layperson, I guess, and even people in cybersecurity, we focus on the preventative side of cyber security, as opposed to what some people call detect and respond. So again, what that means is we do the kind of prevention is better than cure part of cybersecurity, and many other folks focus on, I think what's maybe seems like the sexier side, but that's called detect and respond. And that's really, I guess, an analogy. It's like catching the bad people in the act, bad actors, and then it's really the cleanup of that afterwards. And so that's essentially what we do. I joined in 2017. Tenable landed in Ireland in 2016. I was the first R&D hire, and essentially that was part of an expansion, international expansion move, and that's typical, I think, of US multinationals. A typical motion is to move into Anglo-Saxon markets, put a base into EMEA, and Ireland is a phenomenal place to do that. So that was it, and from 2017 on, there's about 10 of us. We're at about 140 or so today. I'd say roughly half in R&D and half in go-to-market and G&A. So great build out. Our international headquarters, kind of like a mini replica of what we have on the East Coast of the US, in terms of so many different departments being represented, and also some unique teams, unique to Tenable, globally. On the R&D side in particular, we have, teams like data science, which are pretty much unique to the Irish operations. So we're a pretty stellar team, nice location in the heart of Dublin, and doing some really important work.
Fantastic. And I'm going to want to come back to Tenable, of course, and ask you a bit more. But I'd love to start with yourself and tell us a little. We were chatting a little bit about it before we went on air. But tell us a little bit about your journey to here before you ever got to Tenable.
Yeah, it's grew up in Dublin, North Side, proud North Sider. College, studied a thing called property economics, so like a million miles from where I am today, and landed in Symantec, I think, in the late 90s, before the dot-com bubble. And I think I got the job because I played soccer and they were in a software league at the time. So I think that was the deciding factor. But nonetheless, Symantec at the time was a company that had like 4 or 5 different business units. And within a few months of me joining, a guy called John Thompson came in, ex-IBMer. I think he's now on the board of Microsoft globally, or at least he was. A phenomenal leader. And overnight he decided, Symantec's not going to do coding tools or this or that. We're going to be a cybersecurity company. And, talk about ahead of the game. Because back then, while there was, hackers, they were more like what we call back then script kiddies. It was more accidental type, destruction and impact on systems for governments and organizations. So, but it was only in the early 2000s that during that time at Symantec, we saw a huge evolution, in terms of what we call worms and mass mailing worms, which really were impactful on systems. They weren't about maybe stealing data, like in terms of what we see today, or ransoms of organizations. It was much more about, I guess, maybe denial of service and impacting operations. And then in the late 2000s, a huge there was really spyware, so really advertising type capabilities, monitoring type capabilities, keyloggers. And it was only in the late 2000s we saw more of a financial element creep in. So we're seeing like organizations, criminal organizations realize that why kind of rob locally when I can rob remotely, right? And more of the global economy at that stage was moving online. It's still only a small percentage relative to today. And then as late noughties, let's say, we saw then nation state involvement. So at Symantec, the department I worked in was called Symantec Security Response. I worked alongside some phenomenal researchers. I was more like on the engineering, quality engineering side, so ensuring that the solutions they came up with didn't have unintended consequences. But those folks were phenomenal. And around 2010, actually, they discovered a thing called Stuxnet, which was basically,
well.
yes, made a lot of news. But allegedly, the first digital weapon ever made, and allegedly a U.S.-Israeli operation. I think they codenamed it Olympic Games, but ultimately was meant to impact the Iranian nuclear program, and it absolutely did that. It essentially messed with a key component in one of their plants in Natanz, I think it was, which basically interfered with the centrifuges. And to the operators of those, those plants, the messages they were getting on their screen said everything was fine. But in the background, they were running red hot or running too slow on their delicate pieces of equipment. Long story short, set that program back a long, long time. And so I worked alongside some of those guys. They were all based in Dublin, actually, an international team, but based in Dublin. But they knew for months and months they were onto something big because of the level of sophistication, the components, and ultimately. It was interesting. It was so significant. One of the guys, I won't say his name, but he said to me and a few others when we were finishing up on Friday night, if you don't see me on Monday morning, I want you to know I'm very happy. Because when people disappear, when maybe they discover, programs like this, they were known to be depressed or whatever. So, but it just showed the significance of what they had uncovered. But a phenomenal set of folks at Symantec in those days. And then
what an experience. Wow.
Phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And there's umpteen examples of things they discovered. And then after that myself, I transitioned to product management from working with that team. And that was a US-based role. So moved to Mountain View in California, whole new discipline. And great 2 years in headquarters there before moving back. And spent a year or two with Intel before ultimately joining Tenable. So good journey through different roles, even different geographies and different teams, but still all within that cyber domain.
And then I suppose the trajectory within Tenable. So you joined Tenable 9 years ago? 9
years ago, 2017. And like at the time, Tenable was a private company, so I think it had secured the largest Series B round of investment for cyber company a couple of years before that. And I think that was like the V1 of Tenable up to that point, and then we were approaching $100 million in revenue, and then exactly the time I joined, new CEO, second CEO ever. Really, the strategy was to get to $1 billion, which we're closing in on as we speak. So that was like the second act, and it was phenomenal to see company move from being a private company to then within a year and a half becoming a public company, and also the interest in the contrast in terms of how companies need to operate in terms of being private versus public. Private, well, you have private investors. You're not reporting to Wall Street every quarter, so the dynamics are different. Some things are looser, and maybe you might think better, but equally when you go public, there's very, very few public companies out there relative to the broader set of companies. It's a small fraction of 1%. So to get to that stage is phenomenal, and it puts you on a whole new kind of platform.
Of course.
And especially with Tenable being focused on the enterprise security space, you're more significant simply when you're a public company on many different levels. Many things are held to a higher, degree of accountability. And so that was phenomenal. And even, I was fortunate enough to be there that day in New York when the company went public, and just to see the maybe it's a bit nerdy, but the machinations of how a company goes from private to public. Overnight, I think the underwriters, they're trying to set a share price target, and then you're actually looking at the guys on the phone trying to set a target, and until there's a kind of a what would I say, the volatility is removed from that, you don't actually float. So when I think Tenable floated that day around $30 or $33. So it's just fascinating to see that process actually unfold just from...
To see it firsthand.
Exactly.
It's remarkable,
So it's very, very, very fortunate that was definitely a highlight. And that, from that point on, moving through being a public company, at that point, Tenable was mostly focused on organic growth. So, if we needed to do, develop a new project, a new initiative, focus on a new product line, it was typically done organically. But, at a certain point in time, we adapted to maybe what's more typical in our space, which is more of an acquisition type focus. So Tenable is very much, because simply there's advantages, it's faster. To get to market and get those capabilities that you need or believe you need to customers. So the focus has been more on the acquisition side since then.
And you mentioned a really impressive leader there that you clearly thought was impressive. So I want to ask you about that. What does a good leader look like for you?
It's varied. Certainly, I think experience. I think our space is pretty. You need a certain expertise, I think, and I think it certainly helps to have experience in that space. And I can't speak to other spaces, but certainly for cyber, definitely helps because there's so many nuances to it, and so I think that certainly helps. In terms of general leadership, I think an appreciation of broad skill sets though as well. I think balance across a team is absolutely huge, and then equally, I think not to be maybe biased in terms of who you bring onto a team. What's really interesting is, from a career journey perspective, is some of the best people I've worked with have had the most kind of bizarre backgrounds. And even just to take the example back in the day of security researchers, like some of the best researchers, not just at a company I worked with, but worldwide. One of the guys had a history degree. I mean, so I had to become one of the best security researchers, reverse engineers, threat investigators. It's just sometimes you're taking like hobbyist skills into a professional environment, and then you're one of the best in the world at that. And likewise, some other folks I worked with, no college degree, and some companies I've been with have acquired companies that were run by those folks, and they're just natural born entrepreneurs. No college whatsoever. So I think an appreciation as a leader. Don't just look for the kind of the vanilla, formulaic type CV or resume. You really need to appreciate what different folks can bring to the table, and so I think there are just few of the things that I would look at and hope to see in leaders as well around me.
Yeah, I love that. That's fascinating. And one of the advantages of acquisition as well is you often pull in very different people than you might have thought of.
Yeah.
Interesting. And coming back to Tenable a little bit as well, everything that's going on at the moment, and the fact that you're very much on the kind of almost the defense or the prevention side, I should say, really, rather AI and all these kind of developments and the massive change happening so rapidly. How does somebody like Tenable deal with all of that?
Yeah, I think it's disruptive, I think, to many different disciplines, business, personal. It's phenomenal upside. I think there's a lot of money going into AI right now. I still think there's uncertainty as to who the winners and losers are going to be. It feels a little like, for those of us that are old enough, so I'm giving away my age here, the dot-com
it does
boom,
feel a bit like it, doesn't
bubble
it?
and bust. And, everyone knew there was disruption happening there, but it wasn't clear until it bust who the actual winners were and what we gained out of it. AI may be somewhat similar in the sense there's huge investment gone into the space right now, and it's not clear, where the monetization will be, and equally, bizarrely, potential to eat itself, or at least part of itself, in the sense that if there's less people working, who's going to pay for it, But nonetheless, from a cyber perspective, many impacts. I think there's the security of the models themselves, which is absolutely huge, and the onus it primarily is on the folks that create them, but there will be folks that help with assess that for sure. Likewise, I think there's the human teaming, human machine teaming element, which is really, notion as to how does AI help make existing folks more productive. So within cybersecurity, for example, there's in most organizations, at least mature organizations, cyber operations centers, and it's a minefield. Those folks, different tiers of folks, but it's a tough job. Really trying to piece together various inputs of data and information to understand if an attack's actually happening against that organization. So it's tough, but certainly AI can help in those situations to help paint that picture much more quickly. And there's a notion of really human would team up with machine, and AI intelligence to help perform that task faster. And likewise, on the preventative side, understanding which threats are most risky, and then moving through a workflow situation to a fixed situation can be greatly made more efficient through AI as well. There's sometimes quite basic and manual tasks that are important today, but they can absolutely be accelerated through the use of AI. And then, on the flip side it's defenders are defenders because there's attackers on the other side, and there's certainly, a feeling out there that, and there's some early evidence that attackers are moving much, much faster because they're equipped with AI. Attacks that would have taken maybe weeks to put together, and execute in the past are taking now maybe minutes and hours. So organizations, and even the people helping those organizations like ourselves, need to think about that. And we are made an acquisition last year related to AI. And then, the final point on that is Tenable's Chief Information Security Officer, Bob Huber, made that kind of one of his 2026 predictions, was that organizations will not be able to operate as they did in 2025 and 2026. And the specific example he gave was, in order to address risks that someone like Tenable would highlight in your organization, you have to go through a pretty elaborate workflow process. And there's good reason for that. You can't just go in and make changes to important systems in your organizations, because you don't always know of the impact it could have, maybe some unintended consequences. So this thing that we call, the magic button, auto remediate, which is, hey, I just want to fix it, like hit that button. It doesn't really exist in reality in mature organizations, and as I say, there's good reason for it. But in the face of the onslaught of AI and how fast attackers will move, that will need to become the default in 2026. And that's a seismic change for many organizations, and also potentially has implications for regulation as well, because some organizations are heavily regulated and simply have to have these change control processes in place. So again, it's an example of where regulation needs to adapt to meet the times, and that's going to be a real challenge for organizations in 2026.
And then I suppose, you guys, how long has Tenable in Ireland?
Since 2016.
2016, okay, yeah, so sort of a year before you started,
yeah.
Am I right? Yeah, very good. The relationship with the IDA are our partners on the podcast. What has that been, and do you work closely with them these days?
Yeah, absolutely phenomenal. So we've had a really strong relationship with the IDA since my day one, but even pre my day one in 2017. And, going back to when Tenable was looking overseas, there was obviously various options, and but very quickly Ireland was number one on the list, and then within Ireland the company ultimately settled on Dublin, and so that was done in tandem with the IDA. So I think there's a very tight partnership from even before laying down any foundations here, and then since then. We've had a phenomenal relationship with them, with many of the team here, past and present, and that continues, I think, in terms of just day-to-day supports. There's obviously programs. We want to do more R&D, and IDA provides those supports through credits and grants on the R&D side. So they've been phenomenal for Tenable. And then just likewise, I think the support we get when we have our executive team fly in to fly the flag for Ireland Inc., explain what it's all about, is really important. And the guys have always been available, So that's important, I think, and to, for organizations like Tenable and other multinationals to realize that, not only do they have the IDA, but, IDA are almost a proxy for, access to government and if it's ever required. So the support's been multifaceted. And then obviously there's the last piece is probably the networking piece. Sometimes you might need help on a particular problem, and there's hundreds and hundreds of folks here in Ireland in various multinationals that have done this before. So they're always there to help figure out hard problems as well. So it's great, phenomenal relationship with the IDA.
Excellent. And tell me then, I suppose, looking to the future, whether it's the future of Tenable, the future of cybersecurity, the future of technology, are there any sort of trends that you see coming down the line?
I think one we mentioned is the speed, AI. And AI, while we don't know who the winners and losers are going to be, I think there's so much discussion, not just in businesses, but in the general population as well. So it's been disruptive since it's had its kind of breakout moment a few years ago. I think something that has the potential to be as seismic is probably quantum. And again, it feels like we haven't had the breakout moment yet, and maybe there won't be. It'll be more of a gradual thing. But the feeling is that can be as disruptive, as AI. So, but there's not a lot of people giving a huge amount of thought to it, and that's okay. It's difficult, I think, to even comprehend what it may or may not do. But certainly from a cyber perspective, there's going to be implications. I think the basis of cyber in terms of privacy in particular, security, is encryption, and it's the base for many things we do in cyber, but it's the basis for general privacy and security. And the algorithms we have today simply won't stand up in the face of quantum. And we see that today with attackers, where they are basically, if they do get access to governments or organizations, they are hoovering up the data. They know they can't decrypt it all, or the cost to do it is prohibitive. But it's done because the belief and the bet is that shortly they will have the ability to decrypt that. And now again, obviously, the longer that gap is, the worse it is for them. The value of what they have goes down. But nonetheless, it'll have some kind of value. And if that day is sooner than we think, it'll have a lot more value and possibly significant implications for not just organizations and governments, but potentially for us all. So less discussed, I think, but potentially as disruptive as what we're seeing now with AI.
Well, look, that's a fascinating note on which to end. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Anne.
Absolutely fascinating to chat cyber with you. Thanks a million.
Thanks, appreciate it. Thank you very much.